The minimal difference. One can imagine a Stalinist tragedy proper which would occur when the accused in a show trial, an ex-member of the nomenklatura, is compelled to admit that the unjust punishment that befell him is the outcome of his own previous political activity and is, in this sense, a sign of an ironic justice. That is, that, in this sense, he effectively is objectively guilty. But can one imagine Stalin himself undergoing a similar experience, recognizing in the madness of counter-revolutionary plots popping up all around him the result of his own madness? For structural reasons, no. What one can imagine is a successful coup d'etat staged by the upper nomenklatura against Stalin, say in the last years of his life, when they were all again threatened by Stalin's anti-Semitic paranoia. But it would have been impossible to organize a show trial against Stalin himself, compelling him to confess that he had headed a conspiracy against true socialism. The most they could have done was to kill him discreetly while elevating him simultaneously into an untouchable dead master. In a way, this did happen in the late 1930s. One should always bear in mind that the notion of the infallibility of the Pope was forged in the late 19th century not to increase his power, but to curb it. A pope cannot nullify the decisions of his predecessors, since they are by definition infallible. And a similar paradox holds for Stalin. His deification, elevation into the untouchable supreme leader, coincides with the limitation of his real power. At the climax of the Great Purges, when the spiral of carnivalesque self-destruction threatened to swallow the upper nomenklatura itself, the Politburo stood up to Stalin, forcing him to share his authority with them. The standard characterization of Stalinist regimes as bureaucratic socialism is totally misleading and self-mystifying. It is the way the Stalinist regime itself perceived its problem, the cause of its failures and troubles. If there were not enough products in the stores, if the authorities failed to respond to people's demands, and so on and so forth, what was easier than to blame the bureaucratic attitude of indifference, petty arrogance, etc. No wonder that, from the late 1920s onwards, Stalin was writing attacks on bureaucracy, on bureaucratic attitudes. Bureaucratism was nothing but an effect of the functioning of Stalinist regimes, and the paradox is that it is the ultimate misnomer. What Stalinist regimes really lacked was precisely an efficient bureaucracy, a depoliticized and competent administrative apparatus. One of the arguments of those who insist that communism, not fascism, was the true ethico-political catastrophe of the 20th century rests on the fact that in all of Nazi Germany there were only 25,000 Gestapo secret policemen to control the population, while the tiny GDR alone employed 100,000 secret policemen to control its much smaller population. Clear proof of the much more oppressive nature of the communist regime. However, what if one reads this fact in a different way? Fewer Gestapo agents were needed because the German population was much more morally corrupted in supporting the Nazis, and thus collaborated with the regime, than the GDR population. Why? Why did the GDR population resist much more? The answer is a paradoxical one. It is not that the people simply retained their ethical independence, so that the regime was alienated from the substantial ethical life of the majority. Quite the contrary, resistance was an indication of the success of the ruling ideology. In their very resistance to the communist regime, the people relied on the official ideology itself, which often blatantly contradicted reality. Actual freedom, social solidarity, true democracy. One should never forget the extent to which the dissident resistance was indebted to the official ideology. For this precise reason, one can claim that today's North Korea is no longer a communist country, not even in the Stalinist sense. It cut the links with the legacy of the Enlightenment, whose notion of universality compels a regime to expose all its citizens to official propaganda. Shin Hyok, who escaped a total control zone in North Korea and reached South Korea via China, reports that the prisoners sent to such zones can never come out, They are put to work in mines or logging camps until they die. The authorities do not even bother to give them ideological education. The children who are born to parents in these zones, and destined to spend their entire lives in them, are only taught the elementary skills necessary for mining and farming. There were up to 1,000 children, but no textbooks, in the school at Valley No. 2, the part of the camp where Shin lived. In all of North Korea, villages are decorated with communist slogans and portraits of Kim Jong-il. Valley No. 2 had only one slogan carved into a wooden plaque: "Everyone obey the regulations." What we have here is thus the disciplinary mechanism at its purest, deprived of any ideological justification. All North Koreans are expected to look up to their beloved leader. When blind patients were asked by Western journalists why they wanted to see, they all claimed that it was in order to catch the sight of Kim Jong-il, to whom they owed everything. All except those prisoners who are thus literally reduced to subhuman status, excluded from the social community. It is worth returning here to Ernst Nolte's book on Heidegger, because it seriously approaches the task of grasping Nazism as a feasible political project, of trying to recreate the story the Nazis were telling themselves about themselves, which is a sine qua non of the effective criticism. The same has to be done for Stalinism. Nolte also formulated the basic terms and topics of the revisionist debate, whose first tenet is to objectively compare fascism and communism. Fascism, and even Nazism, was ultimately a reaction to the communist threat and a repetition of its worst practices: concentration camps, mass liquidations of political enemies. Could it be the case that the National Socialists and Hitler carried out an Asiatic deed, the Holocaust, only because they considered themselves and their kind to be potential or actual victims of a Bolshevik Asiatic deed? Didn't the Gulag Archipelago precede Auschwitz? Reprehensible as it was, Nazism was thus temporally what appeared after communism. It was also, with regard to its content, an excessive reaction to the communist threat. Furthermore, all the horrors committed by Nazism merely copied the horrors already committed by Soviet communism: the reign of the secret police, concentration camps, genocidal terror. Nolte's conclusion is thus that communism and Nazism share the same totalitarian form, and that the difference concerns only the empirical agents which fill the same structural places: Jews instead of class enemy, and so on and so forth. The standard liberal leftist reaction to Nolte consisted in a moralistic outcry. Nolte relativizes Nazism, reducing it to a secondary echo of communist evil. But how can one even compare communism, this thwarted attempt at liberation, with the radical evil of Nazism? In contrast to this dismissal, one should fully concede Nolte's central point. Yes, Nazism was in fact a reaction to the communist threat. It did indeed just replace class struggle with the struggle between Aryans and Jews. The problem, however, resides in this just, which is by no means as innocent as it appears. We are dealing here with displacement, Verschiebung, in the Freudian sense of the term. Nazism displaces class struggle onto racial struggle, and thereby obfuscates its true site. What changes in the passage from communism to Nazism is the form, and it is in this change of the form that the Nazi ideological mystification resides. The political struggle is naturalized into the racial conflict. The class antagonism inherent in the social structure is reduced to the invasion of a foreign, Jewish body, which disturbs the harmony of the Aryan community. The difference between fascism and communism is thus formal ontological. It is not, as Nolte claims, that we have in both cases the same formal antagonistic structure, where only the place of the enemy is filled in with a different positive element: class, race. In the case of race, we are dealing with a positive naturalized element. The presupposed organic unity of society is perturbed by the intrusion of the foreign body. while class antagonism is absolutely inherent in and constitutive of the social field. Fascism thus obfuscates antagonism, translating it into a conflict of positive opposed terms. It is here that one has to make the choice, the pure liberal stance of equidistance towards leftist and rightist totalitarianism. They are both bad, based on the intolerance of political and other differences, the rejection of democratic and humanist values, and so on, is a priori false. One has to take sides and proclaim one fundamentally worse than the other. For this reason, the ongoing relativization of fascism, the notion that one should rationally compare the two totalitarianisms, etc., always involves the explicit or implicit thesis that fascism was better than communism, an understandable reaction to the communist threat. In a letter, to which I have already referred in Chapter 3, to Herbert Marcuse on January 20th, 1948, Heidegger wrote, "To the serious legitimate charges that you express about a regime that murdered millions of Jews, I can merely add that if instead of Jews you had written East Germans, then the same holds true for one of the Allies, with the difference that everything that has occurred since 1945 has become public knowledge, while the bloody terror of the Nazis, in point of fact, had been kept a secret from the German people." Marcuse was fully justified in replying that the thin difference between brutally expatriating people and burning them in a concentration camp is the line that, at that moment, separated civilization from barbarism. One should not shrink from going a step further. The thin difference between the Stalinist Gulag and the Nazi annihilation camp was also, at that historical moment, the difference between civilization and barbarism. Let us take Stalinism at its most brutal, the de-kulakization of the early 1930s. Stalin's slogan was that kulaks as a class should be liquidated. What does this mean? It can mean many things, from taking away their property, land, to forcibly removing them to other areas, say from Ukraine to Siberia, or simply into a gulag. But it did not mean simply to kill them all. The goal was to liquidate them as a class, not as individuals. Even when the rural population was deliberately starved, millions of dead in Ukraine again, the goal was not to kill them all, but to break their backbone, to brutally crush their resistance, to show them who was the master. The difference, minimal but crucial, persists here with regard to the Nazi de-Judaization, where the ultimate goal effectively was to annihilate them as individuals, to make them disappear as a race. In this sense, then, Ernst Nolte is right. Nazism was a repetition, a copy of Bolshevism. In Nietzsche's terms, it was a profoundly reactive phenomenon.